So there is this unholy alliance of the big industrial food producers who generate all these products out of refined grains, sugar, and seed oils. That's where the money is. And the pharmaceutical industry, which sells all the drugs to treat the conditions that are driven by this poor quality diet. So you've got two very large, powerful economic interests that want to maintain the status quo. And when I discovered I had type 2 diabetes, I instantly stopped eating carbohydrates. And when I stopped eating carbohydrates, miraculous changes happened very quickly, and it altered the course of my life and my career.
Where are you? Are you still up in Canada, or where are you at currently?
I live in West Vancouver, and that's where I am today.
Okay. So definitely Canada. Well, I'm not far from you. I'm down near Seattle, so I'm not a couple hours away,
Oh,
sounds
yeah.
like. So,
Do you live? Is that where you live?
yeah, I've been here for a couple of years. So I've been up to
Well,
Vancouver quite a few times.
we share the same climate.
Yeah, it's a little cold today. I heard about you, it's been maybe 10 years ago. You did I remember you did a documentary on some of the First Nations folks up somewhere in Canada. I can't remember exactly where it was. And you'd utilize a low carb diet to basically help them out. And let me just, before we get too far into it, maybe you can just share your background a little bit.
I'm Métis, which is one of the indigenous populations in Canada. My family come from the far north of Alberta, the adjacent province here. And like all indigenous populations here, they were riven with type 2 diabetes. I eventually developed type 2 diabetes myself about 21 years ago, actually. And I'm a medical doctor trained in family medicine. Was not practicing clinically at the time. I had drifted into government bureaucracy. I was working for Health Canada at the time. And when I discovered I had type 2 diabetes, I instantly stopped eating carbohydrates because my knowledge about diabetes was typical for an MD, and I understood that carbohydrates raise your blood sugar. And when I stopped eating carbohydrates, miraculous changes happened very quickly, and it altered the course of my life and my career because I became very curious about this and why, for instance, it isn't the first line treatment for diabetes, and why it is so effective, and how much this is generalizable. So that led me into all kinds of interesting places and meeting interesting people.
And obviously we share very similar perspectives on what, particularly with regard to how to treat diabetes. Clearly, in my view, critics will often say that you're not really treating the disease, you're just masking the symptoms. You're not, and if you were to give somebody an oral glucose tolerance test, they wouldn't do that. But in my experience, I see not only the normalization of the blood glucose, but also the reversal in many cases of the end organ damage. Kidney disease get better, the retinopathy gets better. What has been your experience with, or can you, if somebody says you're just masking the symptoms by not eating carbs or limiting your carbs, what do you say to that?
The approach I take, and I'm doing clinical practice full time now, and I deal with a lot of patients who have diabetes, other manifestations of insulin resistance, and that's the fundamental pathology we're dealing with here. And I counsel my patients that when you develop insulin resistance, you essentially have developed an intolerance to carbohydrates. And that if you continue to eat the foods you no longer tolerate, bad things happen. That's basically the definition of food intolerance. And conversely, if you eliminate the offending foods, things get better. And that happens across multiple organ systems. And I think the fundamental problem is we've been schooled, and this goes back hundreds of years, that we should be eating a diet that's not appropriate for our species. And this is why we have all these epidemics of chronic disease. And by eliminating those foods, you can reverse a lot of the damage. And I don't feel like I've cured my diabetes. I feel like I've put it in remission.
You mentioned school. I think Mark Twain had said, "I was educated once, and it took me years to get over that." And it's like we've all been schooled in a way, and we got to figure. It's like, despite
Mm-hmm.
my medical education, I figured
Mm-hmm.
this stuff out, which is funny. Going back to, you said you're part of the. You said Métis, I believe, is what you said
Métis,
was the indigenous group.
Métis.
You're Métis, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it seems like, in particular, and we see that with the Native American population, Pacific Islanders, there seems to be like just an extreme negative response to the introduction of the more westernized foods. And have you observed that, and why do you think that might be?
There's certainly a vulnerability there. Yeah, I'm reminded, I used to work for First Nations Health with Health Canada, and I traveled a lot. And I was in northern British Columbia once and met with an old doctor who'd been up there for decades. And he said 40, 50 years ago when he first arrived, nobody had diabetes. Now he said it's just an inevitability. After a certain age, everybody's got diabetes. So I think there's been, obviously, diet change is a big factor driving this. But I also, it leads me down the path of thinking of epigenetics. I think that there's a generational amplification of the problem. Because when I was a very young child, that's 7 decades ago, my grandparents were eating a diet full of flour and sugar and lard and Crisco, and they developed type 2 diabetes early on. But here in this area that we're referring to, people had lots of access to their traditional foods. Oops, I think we're getting sunshine in the background here. And they took a while. The introduction of the starchy and sugary foods happened a long time ago, but it took a while for the manifestation to really take hold. So I'm thinking there's an incremental effect, that generational effect, that's probably an epigenetic phenomenon.
Yeah, certainly we see, obviously, maternal health. And if you have a woman who's pregnant and she's pre-diabetic, then the fetus is exposed to this
Yes.
hyperglycemic
Mm-hmm.
environment, and they may be born insulin resistant in some way. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah.
then it seems to, and that's why we think it's genetic, but I think it's just the environment
It's
they're brought up in,
epigenetic.
because, yeah, epigenetic,
It's
right? So
mm-hmm.
obviously, you're probably familiar. There was a guy named Stefansson, Vilmar
Yeah.
Stefansson, who was a fellow Canadian of Icelandic heritage, and he spent a lot of time
Mm-hmm.
up with the Inuit, a different
Mm-hmm.
group, and he basically observed that they were essentially pretty healthy, free disease, and
Mm-hmm.
they basically subsisted on more or less meat, and there's maybe some berries occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
But what has been the traditional population of the group that you're with, and how has that changed over the years?
Yeah, so I'm on the West Coast here, and our First Nations people live on the coast all the way up to the tip of the Alaska Panhandle. And I've traveled extensively in these communities, and I visited the elders, and I've looked at their traditional foods. And we actually published a paper on one of the traditional foods, which is ulican grease. They extract the oil from a little fish, and that's a staple of the diet. And there are berries. People harvest berries, and there are some wild plant foods that they eat, but by and large, the main sources of nutrition are seafood and mammals. And the fascinating one was the ulican grease, where they render the fat out of this little oily fish and they consume that in large quantities. Still, it's still highly valued. There's still a tradition in the northern communities to harvest the ulican grease. So for all intents and purposes, they're eating a low carb keto diet. This is the diet that sustained them for centuries. And these are robust people. Historically, they made wooden canoes out of cedar trees and they paddled across the ocean on them and up and down the coast. There, tremendous cultural heritage there and tremendous ancient nutritional wisdom.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I saw recently in the U.S. we had the food pyramid for a period of time, and it was replaced by my
Mm-hmm.
plate and other variations. And I
Yeah.
saw there was this Canadian food igloo that somebody had proposed, and it had all these tropical fruits and things like that. That I'm like, that doesn't seem to align with what would be historically available. Have you seen that, and what would your comment be on that?
Yeah, these are the nutritionists at work. Health Canada has an army of nutritionists working on these sorts of things. Health Canada produces the food guide, and they struggle to produce ethnically diverse, correct, politically correct guidance to different populations. So with the Inuit, they struggle because they've got to find an excuse for carbohydrates in the Inuit diet, which was traditionally devoid of carbs. So they come up with all these bizarre ideas, and then they frame it in some kind of the traditional language and imagery. But this is what's going on. Nutritionists are the foot soldiers of the status quo when it comes to nutritional policy. You and I are trained in medicine, and we were taught half of what we learn in school will turn out to be wrong, and it's up to us to continue to learn and change, alter course appropriately throughout our careers. I'm convinced that nutritionists are handed a set of stone tablets when they graduate and must never ever deviate, because they seem terribly inflexible even when faced with what I consider overwhelming evidence that these approaches are wrong, especially in the indigenous populations.
Yeah, and as you probably are aware, I think you're acutely aware, there is a sort of a definite sort of push to restrict, reduce, or even in some cases eliminate meat from the diet, the general diet. I know the Canadian health guidelines came out a few years ago, and it was very plant centric. Why do you think that is, and what do you think the result of that might be?
Yeah, did you see my lecture in San Diego in August? The title of which was
I did not. I did not get a chance. I didn't see that. I'm interested to hear about it, though.
I stopped doing talks because they're time consuming and travel involved and so on. But I got talked into doing this one, and the title was The Global Anti-Meat Conspiracy. It was Low Carb USA, Low Carb Down Under, and it's on YouTube now. And in that, I go over some of the interesting things that are going on where there seems to be overlapping agenda out there pushing us towards a plant-based, non-meat diet, which is, as once you've gone down the nutritional science rabbit hole, you do learn that there is no good science to argue in favor of that kind of a diet, and that traditionally and historically, meat is a mainstay of the human diet, and it's one of the reasons we're human, I think. So it's a very curious phenomenon. Why is there all this activity in different sectors pushing us to avoid eating meat? You recall the Eat Lancet diet that was this big project, and there was minuscule amount of meat on the plate. Canada Food Guide, you have to search to find meat in the recommendations. And this is happening all over the place. So in the context of that lecture, and it's an entertaining one, and I would encourage people to look at it, but there is a religious impetus. So there are religions around the world that are committed to vegetarianism. Probably the most important one in the Western world are the Seventh-day Adventists, who since the 1800s have been committed to turning the world into vegetarians. And have had significant success. They founded the first dietetics association in the US and in most of the developed world. They're still influential in those organizations. They have their own university in Loma Linda, which pumps out all kinds of nutritional research, all of which is supportive of a vegetarian diet. They actually published an article 2 or 3 years ago now, essentially boasting how much influence they've had on nutritional policy around the world. Now, their initial impetus was religious. The founder of their sect had visions that God wanted us to be a vegetarian, but they weren't able to convince the world based on religious ideology, so they moved into the health sector, and they published all these largely observational studies, the quality of which is very questionable, all supporting vegetarian diet. And then you leverage that into health policy and the educational institutions and the dietetics associations and so on. And that doesn't convince everybody. So they've hitched their wagon to climate change. Now we're told that we shouldn't eat meat because cows are killing the planet. So there's this sort of incremental progression of attempts to convince us not to eat meat, jumping on board with various different movements to achieve that.
Yeah, you might have seen the UN, I think just yesterday, as part of their COP28, came out and said we're
Mm-hmm.
calling upon the United States to dramatically cut back on beef. I had a kind of an expletive response to
Yeah.
that, because
Yeah.
that's what's being, pushed. And I'm familiar with Ellen G. White and the whole Seventh Day Adventist and the Kellogg's brothers and all the kind of
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
strangeness that occurred back then. And I remember I found a study years ago, it was from the 60s, and they were talking about First Nations cancer rates. I think it was, and
Mm-hmm.
they were dramatically lower, and now they're much
Yeah.
higher.
Yeah.
And when they were
Yeah.
eating their
Mm-hmm.
more traditional sort of low carb, meat heavy diet, they had much lower rates of cancer, including cancer. And
Yeah.
now that they've included I'm sure a lot of processed foods and processed
Mm-hmm.
grains and whatnot, it's increased significantly.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a fascinating study where they looked at breast cancer in Inuit women. And traditional Inuit women, when they come indoors, they take their top off. And the natural history of breast cancer is it becomes very visible if it's not treated.
Mm.
You get large wounds on the breast. And there was a team that went out of the University of Manitoba and traveled across the Canadian Arctic looking for evidence or stories or anyone's historical account of encountering breast cancer, and they could find zero stories of breast cancer. And now
I
I
think
think the risk is equivalent to Canadian general population.
Yeah, I think similar with heart disease. I think they didn't see, there was one
Mm-hmm.
particular group of Inuit, I think it was maybe even Greenland, where they said the first known instance of heart disease was something like the late 50s, the 1950s,
Yeah.
before they'd ever
Mm-hmm.
seen any of it. And of course, they'd
Mm-hmm.
had data on these people since mid 19th century, 1800s. They've been had European
Mm-hmm.
contact with them. Why? So here's one of the things because a lot of people say there's mummies from 500 years ago that show these Inuit that have atherosclerotic disease,
Yes.
and that's their thing that shows, it proves that meat causes heart disease. And one thing
Yeah.
I looked at that I thought was interesting, and I don't know how long it's been going on for, but particularly in the Inuit, and I don't know about all the First Nations folks, but very heavy smokers, very high smoking rates, something like 65,
Yeah.
70% of the population is smoking.
Mm-hmm.
And does that have a role in this, you think?
Well, yeah, I think the uptake of tobacco products occurred, but more recently than those 500-year-old mummies that were found. Those had atherosclerotic change in the arteries, but they also had black lungs. And one of the, I think, problems there is that indoors during the winter, they burn oil in lamps and are exposed to terrible indoor air quality.
Mm.
So I think it's a hard argument to make that it was caused by the diet. I think there are other factors there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess it does make sense, because we know smoking absolutely increases your risk for atherosclerotic disease. And if
Yeah,
you're
totally.
constantly breathing in whatever the noxious fumes are coming off the typical
Mm-hmm.
oils day in and day out, because it's a pretty inhospitable environment. It's pretty cold, and you got to stay indoors a fair bit. So let me go back to what compelled you to make that, or attempt. I know there's a little of that documentary you did, but what compelled you to try to do that? What was it? You were just tired of seeing everybody suffer, and what was it? What was the net end result of all that stuff that you did?
When I reversed my own diabetes, and very quickly and effectively, it struck me that the population that I'm working in has this incredibly intense, tragic epidemic of diabetes. And when, with a bit of a very cursory observation, they've had a tremendous diet change from a healthy diet full of traditional foods, low in starch and sugar, to a diet full of the worst kinds of starches and sugars and seed oils, just everything you can imagine that's harmful. Would this not be reversible if they went back to a more traditional form of diet? So that spawned the idea of doing a study, which I was able to do in this little community. It's on a small island up the coast from here, between British Columbia and Vancouver Island. And we approached the community and said, we think your traditional diet was very low in carbohydrates. We would like to see what happens if you eat your traditional diet again. And if you can't populate it with traditional foods, here are the foods you can use from the store. You could use beef and ham instead of moose, and different low-carb foods in place of their traditional foods if there was a shortage. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation made a really lovely documentary about that. And we had tremendous results. People did very well reversing obesity, diabetes, getting off med. Just what with the knowledge we have now, it's what you would expect.
Sure. And has there been long-term follow-up? Did that stick with some of them? Has it more been broadly adopted? What are your thoughts on that?
So when I did this, I got funding from Health Canada. I seconded over to the university to do it out of the University of British Columbia. And there was a finite period. I had a two-year secondment. So when we finished the intervention, the group in the community, a large proportion of the community was eating this type of diet. And then what happened after that was interesting. After I stopped visiting regularly and we lost the research nurse that was resident in the community, they drifted back. They went back to their old ways, regained weight, things went back to normal. So it was a bit of a disappointment, but it was also a lesson to me that it's not as simple as it seems. I have the wherewithal and the willpower and the ability to make a change and sustain it, but there are other underlying currents of social and mental health issues in this population in general that thwarts these efforts. My feeling is that there are, that people self-medicate with food and with the wrong kinds of foods. And we're dealing with a population that's got a lot of intergenerational trauma. And I think it's hard to keep them on track when their tendency is to self-medicate with food. And I think that's, to my way of thinking, explained why things went the other way after the project ended. Now, in answer to your other question, there are individuals who have been able to do this. I stay in contact with some through social media and so on, who figured it out and are sustaining a low-carb, traditional-style diet and benefiting from it.
You'd mentioned this is a traditional style diet, obviously involves hunting and fishing and I suppose some gathering and things like that. But that obviously convenience is that's why we've got these quote unquote convenience foods, which conveniently make us all sick in many ways. But is that lifestyle no longer doable for the vast majority of people? I guess we're in a modern world, and if you're living more in the remote wilderness, doing your own hunting, is that just not doable for most people?
There are traditional people there. When we first proposed the project in the community, we approached the leadership and gave them a talk about it, and they embraced the idea. And then it took some months before we actually started the project. In the interim, some of the people in the leadership started eating a traditional diet. They stopped eating all the crap food. And I remember one of the gentlemen there and his wife, they literally shed 50 pounds of weight by the time we started the study. And their interpretation was, all I will eat is traditional food. And obviously they were able to sustain that. They had sufficient sources of traditional food. Now, we anticipate that not everybody can do that, but we gave them a framework in terms of looking at the existing food environment and selecting the foods that kind of match the traditional food pattern. In other words, foods devoid of starch and sugar. And I think that's possible wherever you are. I think it's doable, but it takes effort, it takes willpower. I think there are addiction pathways involved, especially when it comes to sugar. So there obviously are challenges. And one of the greatest challenges is all the official messaging telling them to do the opposite, giving them permission to eat all this junk food, telling them to load up on pasta and rice and cheap carbs and sugary products. So it's a struggle, obviously. Some people, the penny drops and they do well, but the vast majority of them, it's very difficult.
Yeah, with regard to, it's 20, we'll have our dietary guidelines, our 5-year update, and it comes out that 95% of the people on the panel have ties to processed food companies or pharmaceutical companies, which seems to be a conflict of interest in my mind. But I don't know if it's similar in Canada. Or do you have any insight into those people that set the policy and make the recommendations? Are they also conflicted potentially?
Yeah. I know the man who led the last revision of our food guide. He's a vegetarian naturopath. And the problem you have there is the actual Health Canada is not a scientific endeavor, it's a political environment. And the lobbying from industry is a factor that influences how things are done. Plus, someone with a vegetarian agenda can find all kinds of scientific peer-reviewed papers in support of that. And a politician who has no background, no depth of understanding in the scientific world can be easily convinced that this is correct because look at all the science that we have and all the big prominent professors who line up and support it. That, I think, is a significant problem in how these things are generated. I don't the influence of industry happens at the political level. I don't think it really happens in the office where they generate the policy. I think if they generated a policy that went against industry and interests, then they would get their change by the political level.
Yeah, it's frustrating to see that. And my belief is I think the market has to change it. I think we, as a market force, that's probably the most, where we have the most power as a collective number of people. And as you just, again, we have social media to some degree when it's not being, I know Canada has a policy where they're going to be a little more aggressive with censorship around their social media. I don't know if you've run into that around the health stuff. I know that is one way to limit the reach of your quote unquote free speech. I know the U.S. Constitution and the Canadian policies are slightly different when it comes to free speech. I think, I don't know, maybe not.
I don't think we have as much protection as you have in the U.S. with your First Amendment. And yes, they've instituted a internet censorship policy now. It's in sync with Europe. The EU is passing similar rules and regulations. It also ties in with the UN or the WHO, the Global Health regulations or whatever they're calling it, where they're giving the UN or the WHO is giving itself the power to censor information, disinformation that's a threat to human health. So I think there is a grand conspiracy there that because meat is now being targeted as a problem in the context of global warming is going to be embraced as the biggest challenge to human health. I think you're going to find censorship of people like you and me going forward.
Yeah, I'm fully expecting that. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised if it doesn't happen. But I think this is what we've seen. There's been, obviously, you talk about the vegetarian sort of religious vegetarianism that's been going on since Ellen G. White in the 1860s came up with her visions or whatever it was. And I think they failed to convince a significant number of the people that the plant-based diet is. But I think most of us are still, 98% of the world are still meat eaters. So they haven't done that. It hasn't naturally occurred. I had a quote unquote a debate with vegans the other day, and I said, why hasn't it if it was the right diet, why didn't it just spontaneously occur on its own? Why are you having to fight so hard for this? Why does meat actually taste good to us? And they couldn't come up with a good answer. But it's like I think they failed in their quest to demonstrate that it's superior health wise. I just don't even, I clearly disagree that's even a valid argument, but now they are pivoting towards this climate because it's harder to prove the climate. I can very easily assess my own health. I was just going to look in the mirror and say, I'm healthier when I do this. It's pretty easy for me to verify that, but I have no way to independently verify whether the climate is being changed by what we're doing from a food industry standpoint or anything else, to be honest. And I have to listen to some talking head, and whether their models are accurate or not, I don't know. I can't tell it. So I think that's where the big pivot is coming from. And do you think that you're one guy in Canada? What is the general feel in Canada? Do you think when you talk to people around you, maybe the folks in your particular social circles, are they on board with this, or are many of them skeptical, or what are the thoughts?
So one of the reasons that I was motivated to give this talk in San Diego was in my clinical practice. Whenever I accept a new patient, I do a diet interview. First of all, it's interesting because I talk to my patients and I say, if you're not drinking and doing drugs and crazy stuff, what's the most important thing in terms of the influence on your health? And it's your diet, well, obviously. And then I ask them, has any doctor ever asked you what you eat? And the answer is invariably no. So there's an interesting thing going on there. I think I know why. I think it's because we're pragmatic and we don't waste time on things that don't work. And the only thing we're taught is the food guide: eat more, move more, eat less. And that doesn't work, so why waste any time on it? But anyway, what I find over and very frustratingly is patients tell me, they give me, first of all, they all say, oh, I eat a healthy diet. I eat lots of vegetables and fruit and yada, yada, and I'm avoiding red meat or eating minimal amounts of red meat. And I always ask, why are you doing that? And they really, most of the time, don't have a clear answer. They've just been inculcated with this idea that somehow red meat should be avoided. And I think it ties in with the climate. Some do mention that. Some say, I think it's part of the climate solution. And some of them have this vague idea that it's bad for their health. And I find that troublesome. The practice I have is in an upscale community, high socioeconomics, people are educated, and here they are succumbing to this propaganda. I find it troublesome.
How do you, I assume you're at least taking the time to ask people about their dietary history. Are you able to then impact that in a way? Because I know clearly if you fix people's diet, a lot of these diseases just magically get better in many ways, or at least they significantly improve. Are you able to have any influence on that?
Yes and no. I've had people go away thinking I'm some kind of nutcase, but I've had some successes. I'm just thinking of one woman, lovely woman in her 50s, who has been seeing me for a while and is very keto oriented, started complaining of joint pain. So I said, why don't you try carnivore? And I haven't seen her for 2 years.
Maybe
Her husband came in and
oh,
no, the opposite. Her husband came in and he said, oh yeah, she's totally fine and she's totally into carnivore and all her joint pain went away and her asthma went away. She got off all her inhalers. So there's individual cases where people do embrace things and do well. But I'm one guy in one little clinic. I'm not making a big impact on the whole situation. And it's troublesome to me. Look at all these things that are going on in Europe now where they're buying up the farms and putting farmers out of business, reducing cattle. The situation in Holland where I think they want 30% of the farms to be shut down. And the farmers to get the buyout have to sign a document promising not to farm anywhere in the EU. So it's not just a local problem in Holland, it's a global problem across Europe that they want to eliminate cattle.
There's a pretty big pushback. I know Holland, the Netherlands just had an election and it was Denmark, maybe it was Holland. I can't remember, but they basically rejected that policy that, I think, and they're going to maybe say no. And so we're seeing some pushback, which I think is a good thing. I think we need to protect our food supply because gosh, if we don't have healthy people, then what do you have as a nation? You just have,
you see, the problem is if countries like Holland sign on to the WHO global health rules, the WHO will then have the power to censor information in Holland. They can shut down people like you and me. So I'm worried. I'm worried that first of all, the vegan, vegetarian, cultish agenda gets way more airtime than it should. And then secondly, that all this piling on, adding in climate change issues and so on is actually being successful in getting people on side. And I find that deeply troubling. I grew up in Alberta, and people that tell me cows are harming the planet, I say, come, let's go for a drive through southern Alberta, and you'll see these vast natural grasslands with cattle grazing here and there. And just explain to me, how's that harming the planet? Because it clearly isn't.
Yeah, it is. Like I said, whether or not man is changing the environment or the climate is in many means debatable, but I think if you're going to accept that, the really bad part is saying cows are the major cause of that when they're clearly not. It's overwhelmingly that they actually have a net benefit on our society. If nothing else, they just nourish us. They're such high quality nutrition, and it's not just calories, it's actually nutrients. Because a lot of times they'll do these metrics, we'll say, this is how many calories you can get from a crop of soybeans, and this is how many you can get from a cow. But it's not just about calories. It's about more than just
No,
calories. It's nutrients.
it's about bioavailability. It's about a whole bunch of things. But red meat is almost unique in the fact that it's one of the rare foods that you can live on almost exclusively. And why would they target a food like that? Now, look at the US. There are as many horses as there are dairy cattle in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Why
Right.
doesn't
About
anybody
9
target
million each. Yeah.
horses? Yeah, nobody's eating horses, not to a large extent. If you look at pet food in the US, there's enough protein generated in pet food to feed 70 million people. Nobody's telling us to get rid of our cats and dogs. Why are they telling us to get rid of our beef cattle? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I'd heard Frank Mitloner make those same points.
Yeah,
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 it's clearly there's a bias there, and I think my thought is when like I'm on a carnivorous diet, I eat just basically red meat, and I don't really want anything else.
yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
no longer addicted to all the processed food. I'm no longer spending money on that. I'm not spending money on healthcare dollars, and so you have these like in the U.S. The USDA is corporate capture, just like the FDA is, and you've got all these people they're on the USDA, and then they go sit on the board of Nabisco and PepsiCo and Coca-Cola and stuff like that. So I think that's what we have, and I think it's pretty clear. It's certainly about money in many ways.
So there is this unholy alliance of the big industrial food producers who generate all these products out of refined grains, sugar, and seed oils. That's where the money is. And the pharmaceutical industry, which sells all the drugs to treat the conditions that are driven by this poor quality diet. So you've got two very large, powerful economic interests that want to maintain the status quo. It's troubling.
Yeah, I was on this Joe Rogan podcast yesterday. I made that very exact same point. This is what is going on. So that's getting some ears on it, some eyes and ears on it. So at least maybe enough people will say, hey, look, this is not tenable anymore, and maybe we'll have some success, but we have to keep fighting, fighting tooth and nail every day to do that. Let me ask, what is your personal diet? What do you typically eat?
Oh, so I've been keto for 21 years. I lost about 35 pounds and have kept it off. I've managed my diabetes. Everything's in the normal range with no medication throughout that period of time. And I've had periods of carnivore where I eat just meat and eggs. These days, I verge on carnivore. I eat ribeye steak just about every day, but I eat cheese, and occasionally I'll have caprese salad with my steak. Or I love a ribeye with some boursin cheese. That's a very satisfying meal. So I am verging on carnivore a lot of the time. And I'm 73. I work full time. I work a full clinical load. I chase my teenage daughter down Whistler Mountain on the weekends. I'm doing pretty well. In fact, much better than I did 21 years ago before I started this.
Yeah, that's what I've always often seen the criticism of when people say like Inuit are used as an example of a low carb or nearly carnivorous population. They always say their life expectancy is only 68 and the average Canadian lives to 78 or something like that. Why do you think that is? And is there something else going on there? Obviously I look at socioeconomic status and smoking rates and on, but why do you think there's a difference there?
I think there's an arrogance of modern society that assumes we're much better than anybody that came before us. I think infant mortality is a factor in life expectancy numbers. I think there's plenty of evidence that there are very elderly indigenous people historically, and that may have been a dangerous lifestyle, but not because of diet, and that people had accidents. Infectious disease wasn't a big problem until people started aggregating in communities where they lived in close quarters. I think it's a bogus argument. I don't see the merits of it, quite frankly.
Yeah, I was looking the other day on this and looking at some of the initial early contact, European contact. I think it was Russians that actually contacted some of the maybe in the Greenland area or something, or maybe parts of Canada, and they found that there were a number of people that were in their 80s and 90s, even back in the 1800s, And I'd
Yeah.
read recently there was like a whale hunt, because that's still done among some of the First Nations folks up
Yeah.
there. And the oldest participant was in his 90s, still out there on a boat hunting whales, which I thought was pretty impressive. I don't know how hard it is to hunt a
Yeah.
whale, but it's got to be pretty challenging physically.
Yeah. I'm sure you're familiar with Steve Finney, and he and I've
Yeah.
collaborated over the years. And he was very fascinated with the diaries of northern Arctic explorers of the decades and centuries. And he found accounts where they described old Inuit who remembered events, uh, the date of which could be ascertained, therefore showing as a way of measuring their age, and they were very elderly. So I just think it's a bogus argument.
Yeah, likely it is. And even if not, you compare them from any other comparable socioeconomic group, and it's just, I think they stack up pretty good when you look at that. What, in you, because you have an active clinical practice, and I assume are you doing general practice? I didn't catch your specialty. But
Yeah, I do. 50% of my time is in general practice in an suburban clinic, and the other is in the downtown core. 50% of my time in addiction clinics.
Okay. I was going to go talk a little bit about, because addiction, that's one of the things I've seen with Carnivore, interestingly, is a lot of people, if they're like smokers, alcoholics, drug addicts, a lot of times will be able to more effectively deal with those addictions by fixing their diet. Have you seen any sort of impact on that, on diet, on either mental health or addiction?
I think there's a huge mental health potential there. I'm sure you're familiar with Chris Palmer's work, his book, Brain
Yep.
Energy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm at the point where anybody who's got a problem from the neck up of any sort, I think warrants a keto diet, maybe even a more carnivore diet approach, a trial of that to see if there's benefit. Personally, I found my ability to cope with stress, my mental health was much improved and stabilized on when I made that diet change. In my addiction practice, I'm dealing with people that sleep under bridges, and it's hard to get them on a proper diet. But in my fantasy life, I think I would love to have a facility where I can house them and feed them a proper diet and see if we can fix the addiction problem that way, because their situation now is so desperate. I do have one man I remember now I can think of who did embrace my idea about keto diet and has sustained a keto diet, and he's done very well. So I also think addiction pathways are involved in our obsession with carbohydrates. I think shaking sugar addiction is a big challenge for people who embark on this type of diet. So it's an interesting overlap there of addiction and diet.
Yeah, I wonder, because I remember my time when I would go into ER, and when I was back in training, and we would do psychiatric care for periods of time, and you would have people that would just, they'd be in there every couple of days, and you think about the enormous cost that costs the healthcare system. I mean, that's expensive to do that. And if you could just feed and house these people properly, it would probably be less expensive to actually, for many cases, I think not all, but many of them would probably regain their ability to function in society. But we still I think our priorities are so messed up, and we're just going to here's your Haldol, bud. Haldol Ativan.
Yeah.
When is this? That's a cocktail.
It makes me laugh because I recall one of my patients who was keto ended up in the hospital for something and asked for a keto diet, hospital diet tray. And they kept giving him crappy stuff and finally convinced them to give them a keto diet. They sent me a photograph of it. It was one hard-boiled egg on a tray.
I guess technically it might be, but you're going to get hungry.
It was keto.
Interesting. Yeah. So you said you're not doing a lot of lectures anymore. Do you have any, I guess you just continue practicing, and I guess I'll have to remind me the name of that. You said you gave a speech, Low Carb Down Under. How do we find it on YouTube or something like that?
Yeah, if you Google my name and meat conspiracy, you'll find it. It pops up. Yeah.
Okay.
It's somewhat
I'll have to watch that when
entertaining,
I get a
and
chance.
I kind of cruise it superficially across some of these issues, the climate issue, the religious issues and so on.
What I was going to say, you mentioned a little bit of social media, and I know social media is a double-edged sword. It's a time waste, but at the same time, it's really one of the tools we have to get this information out, because it's not coming from, you're not going to have Justin Trudeau telling everybody on the planet in Canada to start a keto diet. I doubt that's going to happen anytime. How do we find you on social media if we wanted to find out where to go and learn some more about this stuff?
Oh boy, I used to maintain a blog, but it's been moribund for a few years. I'm on Facebook, but it's a closed group because I just find it's too hard to deal with all the crazy stuff. Yeah, you can't find me. That's the problem. Yeah, I do. It's funny. I do have people tracking me down in my medical practice and asking to come and see me there, and I do private consults for people that way. Sometimes through media, not in person. I'm not sure why people would want to contact me, actually, because I'm just very, very, very much focused on clinical practice one-on-one these days, and I'm not out and about. I find there are so many other good people like you and many others who are doing a tremendous job in the social media space that I don't feel the need to be there.
I think every voice counts, and obviously, if somebody's your experience and your particular insight, particularly, at the very least, particularly with regard to addiction and maybe a relationship with the indigenous population, because to me, it's very sad because I'm not indigenous. I'm a white guy from Europe, but I used to work with the Navajo, and I would just see these people that historically would have been a really impressive, robust, physically vigorous population. And all my interactions were end-stage renal disease, osteoporosis, diabetes, cutting off their legs and feet, and it's just sad. And alcoholism. It's just sad to see what has become to that particular culture, and when it didn't need to be that way. And a lot of it has started with nutrition in a way.
It's tragic. It's tragic. It's a slow motion train wreck, and there's a sense of inevitability in those communities. It's just very tragic. You know what? If people do want to reach out to me, you can send an email. I hate to be so elusive. It's wortman.md@gmail.com. That's WORTMAN.md@gmail.com.
Okay. I know you mentioned doing I have to go do a consultation right now as well. So, Dr. Wortman, thank you for taking a little time. Appreciate, like I said, you were one of these, like when I was first getting into nutrition and a dozen years ago, you were one of the people that I'd saw, and I was like, this is really impressive. You're one of the recent, there's people who've been doing it for a while, but one of the early people that has adopted this. So thanks for doing that and inspiring other people, and wish you continued success and stay healthy.
Yeah, and if you do find yourself up in the Vancouver area, give me a call.
I might. Yeah, I'm sure I'll be up there at some point. That would be interesting to do. So anyway, I'm thinking I might have to go up there over the first of the year or something. But
are you a skier?
All right, well, I a little bit. My son's doing it a lot, and my spouse is doing it. I used to ski a little bit. I've gotten less. I just don't like being as cold. I've gotten away from it, but I can ski. Okay. What I got to do, I'm going to stop recording right now, and